A fire that destroyed a palace accidentally preserved the greatest library the ancient world had ever seen, and what was inside it rewrote everything. Somewhere beneath the dust of northern Iraq, beneath a mound walked over by conquerors, farmers, and shepherds for 2,500 years, a British excavator broke through a wall of scorched brick and found himself standing inside a room whose floor was carpeted in something that had no right to exist. Thousands of clay tablets, baked hard by the very fire that had brought the palace down, stacked, shelved, and cataloged an entire written world sealed underground the night Nineveh fell in 612 BC. The final count surpassed 30,000, and when scholars finally deciphered what was written on them, they did not simply add a footnote to history. They were forced to throw out the entire story of Assyria and start again. Who the Assyrians actually were, what they thought about, what they read at night, and how completely the world's picture of them, painted almost entirely by their enemies, had misled everyone who inherited it. That is what the library revealed. Austen Henry Layard was not looking for a library. He was a young British traveler with an interest in ruins, working the mounds of northern Mesopotamia in the 1840s, hoping to find the wall reliefs and monumental sculpture that had begun to appear in similar excavations across the region. The mound above the ancient city of Nineveh, opposite the modern city of Mosul, was the obvious target. Under it, buried beneath centuries of accumulated debris, lay the palace of Sennacherib, the Assyrian king whose armies had marched into the Hebrew Bible. Layard's initial expectation was straightforward. Statues, reliefs, perhaps inscriptions carved into stone slabs, the material of a royal palace. What he found, in a chamber near the palace's southwestern wing, was different. The floor was covered, in places to a depth of half a meter, with baked clay tablets, some intact, most broken, all of them inscribed with the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform, the script that had been used across Mesopotamia for 3,000 years and that no living person could read. His first assumption was the assumption anyone would have made: administrative records, tax documents, palace inventories, the bureaucratic residue of a working royal household. It was the reasonable explanation. It was wrong. The excavation continued, and a second chamber was found. Then a third. Layard's assistant, Hormuzd Rassam, working the site after Layard's departure, opened a further set of rooms belonging to the palace of Sennacherib's grandson, Ashurbanipal, and inside those rooms, the density of tablets was greater still, thousands more. Some stacked in neat piles, some on collapsed wooden shelves burned to charcoal, some in labeled containers. When the fragments were shipped to the British Museum and the long work of joining them began, the total climbed past 30,000 pieces, representing an estimated 10 to 15,000 original tablets. It became clear that what Layard and Rassam had walked into was not an accident of survival. It was a collection. Deliberate, organized, and cataloged. Assyria had kept a library. The problem was that nobody could read it. Cuneiform in the 1850s was a script known to exist and almost entirely opaque. The languages it recorded, Akkadian and Sumerian, had been dead for 2,000 years. The decipherment process that followed took decades of collaborative work by scholars in London, Paris, and Berlin, working from the trilingual inscriptions of later Persian kings back into the older Mesopotamian layers. The reasonable guess remained administrative material, because that is what most ancient archives turn out to be: receipts, ledgers, contracts. The reading, when it began to yield results in the 1860s and 1870s, produced something else entirely. In 1872, a self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith, working at the British Museum, was sorting through fragments from the Nineveh collection when he came across a tablet describing a flood. A man instructed to build a great vessel, Animals brought aboard in pairs. A bird released to find dry land. The narrative was recognizable immediately, and its date was more than 1,000 years older than the biblical text it resembled. Smith is reported by his colleagues to have stood up from his desk and begun undressing in the reading room in a state of extreme agitation. Whether the specific detail is accurate or embellished by later retelling, the underlying fact is documented. The room recognized what he had found. The tablet was part of what is now called the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it was one item in an archive that turned out to contain the accumulated literary, scientific, religious, and technical writing of Mesopotamia across 2 millennia. The library was not an administrative store. It was the reading collection of a king who had gone to unusual lengths to assemble it. Ashurbanipal, who ruled Assyria from 668 to around 631 BC, is the reason the archive exists in the form it does. Unlike most Assyrian kings, whose training was military and administrative, Ashurbanipal had been educated as a scribe. He could read and write cuneiform in both Akkadian and Sumerian at a level of competence that the tablets themselves record him claiming with evident pride. Letters recovered from the archive show him issuing instructions to his agents across the empire and into Babylonia to acquire tablets. Specific texts by name, complete series, copies from named temple libraries. The letters are direct and precise, the correspondence of a collector who knew what he was looking for. The scale of the acquisition, once assembled, covered essentially everything Mesopotamian literary and technical culture had produced: epic poetry, myths of creation, of the underworld, of the origin of humanity, medical texts organized by symptom and body region, astronomical observations tracking the movements of planets across decades, mathematical exercises, divination manuals of extraordinary elaboration, ritual instructions, prayers, hymns, historical chronicles, royal inscriptions, grammatical texts, and lexical lists, comparing Sumerian and Akkadian vocabulary, legal collections, wisdom literature that included proverbs, dialogues, and reflections on suffering and the nature of the gods. The library was not the palace's business office. It was the working reference collection of a civilization writing about itself. The first question any scholar asks when confronted with an archive this old is simple: why is it still here? Clay tablets are more durable than papyrus or parchment, but they are not indestructible. Water dissolves unbaked clay. Physical impact shatters it. Most tablets across most sites survive only in fragments, and most Mesopotamian archives are known from scattered pieces recovered from destruction layers rather than intact rooms. The Nineveh archive survived for a specific and entirely accidental reason. In 612 BC, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes attacked Nineveh, took the city, and burned it. The Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Near East for 3 centuries, ended within a matter of years. The palace complexes of Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal burned with the rest of the city, and the fire that destroyed them was intense enough to bake the clay tablets stored inside them into a state of permanent hardness. Tablets that had been kept as reference works, most of them unbaked or lightly dried, were fired by the destruction of the building that housed them. The chambers collapsed. Debris covered the surface. The tablets sat inside sealed rooms under the mound for 2,500 years. The library was preserved by the act that ended the civilization that assembled it. The destruction was total. The population of Nineveh was killed or dispersed. What Layard and Rassam entered was a tomb. But the fire, which destroyed everything organic, hardened the clay. The wooden shelves burned to charcoal. The tablets survived. The archive is the accidental gift of the empire's enemies. The decipherment produced immediate consequences that the field is still working through. The first was the flood narrative. The recognition that a story central to the Hebrew Bible existed in an older Mesopotamian form, embedded in a longer poem about a king searching for immortality, forced a fundamental revision of how the biblical text was understood. The relationship between the traditions became a matter of documented textual contact rather than theological assumption. The second was the sheer age of what the archive contained. Many of the tablets in Ashurbanipal's collection were copies of much older works. Sumerian compositions from the 3rd millennium BC, transmitted through centuries of scribal training, appeared in his library in 7th century Akkadian versions with the original Sumerian preserved alongside. The archive was not simply Assyrian, it was a snapshot of 2,000 years of Mesopotamian intellectual continuity, curated by a king who understood what he was preserving. The third was the scientific content. The astronomical tablets recorded planetary positions, eclipses, and lunar cycles with a precision that pushed the documented history of systematic observational science back by more than a millennium from where the Greek tradition had located it. The medical texts organized human illness into categories, described treatments, and listed pharmacological substances with a diagnostic vocabulary that had no counterpart in the surviving records of neighboring cultures at that period. The mathematical material included exercises in geometry, algebra, and calculation that demonstrated a working comprehension of what would later be called the Pythagorean relationship, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. None of this had been visible in the Assyrian record as it existed before Nineveh was excavated. The Assyrians had been known almost exclusively from the accounts of their enemies. The Hebrew Bible describes them as agents of divine punishment, brutal and idolatrous. Greek historians, writing centuries later and secondhand, described a militarized, luxurious, and decadent court. The reliefs on the walls of the palaces themselves, which Layard also recovered, showed siege warfare, deportations, and executions in graphic and unflinching detail. The picture that had reached the modern era was of a machine of conquest with little interior life. The library described something the reliefs had not. The scribes who copied the tablets recorded their names in colophons at the ends of the texts. The colophons name the scribe, the source manuscript, the owner of the copy, and sometimes the reason the copy was made. Ashurbanipal appears repeatedly in these colophons, sometimes as the owner, sometimes with the specific note that the text was copied for the palace of the king. One colophon, repeated across a range of tablets, has Ashurbanipal describing his own training. He states that he learned the scribal craft, that he read the tablets from before the flood, that he understood the difficult passages of Sumerian and Akkadian, that he could resolve mathematical problems, that he could interpret the omens. Whether the claims are entirely accurate or partially the boasting of a royal patron, the underlying situation is documented independently. Ashurbanipal was literate at a technical level, unusual for a monarch of his period, and the library he assembled functioned as a working reference tool for the scholars of his court. Letters recovered from the archive show court astronomers writing to the king with observations and interpretations, physicians writing with diagnoses and treatment recommendations, diviners writing with the results of ritual consultations. The king's response to these letters, where preserved, shows a monarch who understood the technical vocabulary of the disciplines he was employing. The Assyrian court, on the evidence of its own paperwork, was not simply a military headquarters with a throne room attached. It was an institution that maintained a research apparatus, consulted it, and generated further documentation from the consultation. The library contained a text that is now called the Poem of the Righteous Sufferer, an Akkadian composition in which a man of good standing describes his own catastrophic reversal of fortune. He has done everything correctly. He has honored the gods. He has fulfilled his obligations. And yet, illness, social collapse, and abandonment have overtaken him. The poem describes his physical symptoms, his psychological state, and his eventual restoration in a series of dreams. Its structural parallels with the biblical book of Job have been discussed for more than a century. The presence of the poem in Ashurbanipal's library, alongside dialogues about the meaning of piety and reflections on the limits of human understanding of the divine, describes a court that was reading philosophical literature about doubt. This is the point at which the older image of Assyria becomes difficult to sustain. The wall reliefs remain what they are. The Assyrian army did what the reliefs record it doing. But the same palace that displayed the reliefs on its walls contained, in interior chambers, a collection of texts that included sustained reflection on suffering, on the incomprehensibility of divine intention, and on the moral situation of the person who tries to live correctly and is destroyed anyway. Both things were held in the same building. The archive also contained material that the older image of Assyria would have predicted. Royal annals recording campaigns of extraordinary violence, the systematic deportation of populations, the specific methods used to punish rebellious cities, the taking of hostages, the impalement of captured leaders, the destruction of temples belonging to the enemies of the empire. Ashurbanipal himself, in his own royal inscriptions preserved in the archive, describes the treatment of a defeated Elamite king in terms that leave nothing to inference. The king's bones were removed from his tomb and carried to Assyria. His descendants were made to grind those bones in public. The library does not soften this. The same collection that preserved the philosophical poetry preserved the annals that recorded the atrocities. They were catalogued in the same rooms. They were copied by the same scribes. They were read by the same king. Inside a court that kept a reference library covering 2,000 years of accumulated Mesopotamian knowledge, populations were being deported and enemy kings were being desecrated on a scale the ancient world had not previously organized. Both things were true simultaneously. The archive does not resolve the contradiction, it records it. Return to what the library actually produced. More than 30,000 tablet fragments recovered from a burned palace complex in northern Iraq. An archive assembled deliberately by a literate king across the middle of the 7th century BC. A collection containing the accumulated literary, scientific, medical, mathematical, astronomical, religious, and administrative writing of Mesopotamia across 2,000 years. A flood narrative predating the biblical version by more than a millennium, philosophical poetry about the meaning of undeserved suffering, astronomical observations that push the documented history of systematic science beyond where the Greek tradition had placed it, royal correspondence showing a court that consulted its scholars, royal annals recording campaigns of systematic violence cataloged in the same rooms as the philosophy. Together, they form a portrait. The Assyrians were not a footnote. They were a fully realized society operating at a level of intellectual and technical sophistication that the accounts of their enemies had not predicted. They wrote philosophy. They practiced systematic astronomy. They organized medicine. They preserved the literature of the cultures that preceded them, translated across languages, copied across centuries, curated by a king who could read the material he was collecting. They also deported entire populations, destroyed cities, and treated defeated enemies with a precision of cruelty that the archive itself records without embarrassment. These were fully modern humans, running the full range of what fully modern humans do 8 centuries before the Athenian philosophers, and more than 2 millennia before any of the modern institutions that inherited their work knew they existed. Cuneiform tablets exist across Mesopotamia in numbers that cannot be counted. The Ashurbanipal Library is the largest and best preserved of the ancient collections, but it is not the only one. Temple archives, palace archives, and private archives from cities across the region have been recovered in fragmentary form and continue to be recovered. Recent work using digital imaging and machine-assisted reconstruction has begun joining fragments that could not previously be matched, and the corpus of readable text continues to grow. There are certainly more tablets waiting. The library at Nineveh was found by accident by a young British traveler who was looking for wall reliefs and stumbled into a burnt room full of clay. The reading that followed took more than a century and is not finished. But the questions the archive opened about what Assyria actually was, about how completely the account of it written by its enemies had shaped the historical inheritance, about what else remains buried beneath mounds that have not yet been excavated. Those questions now have a method. The scribe who copied the flood tablet did not know that a self-taught Englishman would stand up from a reading room desk 2,500 years later and understand what he had recorded. The king who assembled the library and who wrote in his colophons that he had read the tablets from before the flood did not know that his collection would survive the burning of his capital and become the reason his civilization could still be read at all. They were people. Specific, particular, irreplaceable people living inside a society that wrote philosophy, practiced astronomy, deported nations, and kept its reference library organized across 2,000 years of accumulated learning. The fire preserved them. The decipherment read them. What they revealed was not a primitive world awkwardly preceding our own. It was the same world, running on the same minds, held together by the same contradictions that still define us. We just needed a burned palace in northern Iraq to see it.